What's up everyone, Thralls here once again. I'm Necrotic Nick and I am back with some underrated albums. Now a little while ago, actually it might have been a comment on an underrated albums video I did, someone brought up the prospect of doing industrial metal. And honestly, that was something that kind of just stuck in my head because at one point I was really huge into the sound. And this one dates really far back, like pretty much right along the same time I was just getting into metal in general. This was a whole subset that kind of latched onto me in a different way. There was definitely a period in my teens where I was going to like goth nights and stuff, and they were playing like tons of Ministry, Nine Inch Nails, Chem, FDM, Skinny Puppy, all that stuff. And that sound kind of resonated with me differently. It was heavy in a different sense. And when bands included all those like industrial rhythms and atmosphere and such with heavy, like almost thrash and death metal guitars, I don't know, I kind of got my wires crossed because at the same time, like this was sort of accessible in one way, but still very heavy in another way, and I really got into industrial metal. So I decided to actually do some underrated industrial metal albums. Now, this one I wanted to kind of like cover as many bases within industrial metal as possible in terms of like different styles. Like you have the more danceable, kind of accessible ones. Then you have some that are more closely related to like Godflesh, Fear Factory, you know, ones that actually have a full band that actually employs a lot of industrial samples and keys, and then some that are just like drum machines and dissonant noise and guitars. There's a lot of different ways to approach this, so I kind of went through here and found a lot of different ones that sort of kind of embody different styles of the sound. Now, a couple of these might be a little bit more well known, but I kind of went with a more deep cut, or at least one that is more relevant to metal. But this is an interesting list, and we're just going to get into it. Chemlab, Eastside Militia. This came out in 1996 on Metal Blade Records. This was the second band from this DC, and then they moved to New York band. This industrial metal slash rock band actually featured guest spots from Gino Leonardo from Filter and William Tucker, who played in Ministry and My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, so you actually had some pretty interesting alum there. This one is kind of all over the map. Like this one embodies a lot of different styles of industrial metal slash industrial rock. Opening track, Exile on Mainline, is probably the most metallic track on here. The big fuzzy guitars, the vocals sound like they're being yelled at you through a bullhorn. But all throughout this album, it kind of just checks off just as many boxes as possible. You have more funk-laden stuff, you have more alternative stuff. It kind of varies from like danceable rhythms to like strange atmospheric stuff. It's a really interesting listen. Now this band has kind of a rough history. A lot of these bands actually kind of have rough histories. They broke up not too long after this album, and there have been subsequent reunions and then breakups again and then reunions again. The main guy behind this is still active, I believe. I think Chemlab is technically still around. I'm really not sure. But this was a really interesting album. I picked this one up probably when it came out, and it kind of just resonated with me in terms of like, you know, that kind of KM-FDM-ish kind of sound. Like they kind of embodied that. Like you have very heavy tracks, you have very danceable tracks that are, you know, more accessible. It's a really interesting listen. I still need to check out their earlier stuff, and I don't know if they had anything after this. I can't quite remember. But this is an interesting listen, and I recommend you check it out. Monster Voodoo Machine, Suffersystem. Technically, this is the fourth album from this Toronto-based industrial metal band, though they had moved to Chicago by the time that this album came out. There's a lot of like remixes and EPs and such, but in terms of full lengths, I believe this is number 4, might be a different number. Either way, this came out in 1994 on D-Tribe/RCA Records, and this is a really interesting mishmash of a lot of different things. This is very similar to White Zombie and like a touch of Ministry. Most of the instrumentation is all played. There aren't a lot of drum loops on here. There are a lot of samples and such, and interesting like keys and all sorts of stuff. But when it comes down to like their overall sound, it has so many check marks in terms of like 90s metal. You have groove metal, hardcore, there are thrashy sections. The song Bastard Is As Bastard Does, which they did shoot a video for, which was fiercely 90s, actually has gang vocals in it, and it kind of gives it this hardcore edge. The song Motionless on here has sludge metal riffs. There is a melody that almost screams Crowbar on it. And you have really interesting guest spots. You have Rodney Bottom doing keyboards on the song Fetal Position, I believe, and on the song Defense Mechanism, which is the lone kind of techno track where it's just all techno drums, like it's all just a drum loop. You have the one and only Wesley Willis throwing in a little sample in there and, you know, just doing what Wesley Willis does, or did rather, sorry. All across this album, it sort of just embodies like a lot of things that I liked about the 90s, and the fact that it sounded very much like White Zombie was something I latched onto. I don't have any of their previous material, but I did have the follow-up, which they kind of broke up after this and then reformed, but reformed as more of a straight-up rock/metal band. They stripped out all the industrial elements, and the follow-up, well, it was definitely missing a lot, namely the industrial elements, but also musically it was just kind of different. It did not have the same impact as this one. This one actually won a Juno Award, I believe, in '95, and it pretty much just, again, has all these hallmarks of just like really cool industrial metal. The vocals all have like a static filter on them, but it's very riff driven, and the guitar tone is almost kind of like that proto nu metal tone, like it was a little bit muddy, but you didn't have like an overuse of like nu metal tropes as much in here. This still locked onto like 90s metal in terms of like earlier stuff. Again, this came out in '94. Solid album. I still jam this one frequently. Coming back to this one was pure joy, and I still need to get some of their earlier stuff, but I strongly recommend this. If you're a big White Zombie fan or Ministry fan, there's a damn good chance you'll love this, so check it out. American Head Charge, The War of Art. This was their major label debut and second album on American Records, and this is a Minneapolis-based industrial metal band that had a very rocky history. Granted, they're still around, but a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes. This album came out pretty much around the time where I was really starting to get out of the whole nu metal thing, and I heard this band in terms of like their just really aggressive style of nu metal. It's very groove laden, a lot of Faith No More-ish moments, but grating, like lots of samples and hostility in the lyrics and such. Like there's a lot of just hateful abandon in this, and I really like that. Vocally, I think this album is absolutely awesome. I think all their albums are really good vocally. Their frontman, I believe his name is Chad Heacock or Matt Heacock. He goes by Martin Cock on here, which is a hell of a moniker. He has a very interesting range. He has a very defined kind of high scream, and then he can do this odd crooning, which, I mean, it's kind of comparable to Mike Patton, but he doesn't have that range. But I mean, who does? That dude's amazing. But this album was absolutely killer, and it didn't quite have the impact that I thought it would. I mean, this was coming out the same year as Toxicity, and that was kind of like a nu metal benchmark. But this one kind of, you know, got brushed aside. They did some solid tours opening up for bigger acts like Slipknot and such, but unfortunately didn't latch on. And again, the behind the scenes stuff, unfortunately, they got dropped by American. There was a lot of drug problems throughout. They've had members die. They had a guitarist die of an accidental overdose of sleep medication, and that was incredibly sad. He was actually new. He had joined in at one point. He was on their second album, which was also really good. And then recently, and I didn't even know this until I'd actually looked up the information on this band, their bassist and founding member, Chad Hanks, died of a terminal disease. Wasn't disclosed, or at least as far as I looked. And that sucked because I actually met that dude. And we actually sat down and bullshitted about drinking and doing reckless shit on go-karts. Sounded like a good time. And they had just recently got back together and put out an album. They were on Napalm Records, and it seemed like they were kind of shaping up because this band had, again, a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes. But this album latched on to me, and this was in a kind of a period where I was sort of in flux when it was coming down to like stuff I was getting into in terms of metal, and it just latched on to me. It's dark, it's foreboding, but it's still very melodic in a sense, and loads of hooks on here. So definitely check out this band, check out this release, check out any of their releases, honestly. They're all pretty damn good. I might just be biased because I really like these guys. Either way, check this one out for sure. Total Devastation, Roadmap of Pain. This is their 2003 debut album. This is a Finnish industrial death metal act. And that distinction is pretty important because this is very much in the vein of death metal, but with these samples and drum loops, and I'm not entirely sure they're real or programmed drums. Either way, they sound appropriate for this. There is loads of death metal on here. And it's not like your standard Finnish death metal. Finnish death metal I think of as like kind of murky and almost kind of bordering more on death doom. This is almost more like Floridian. I would actually say this is kind of comparable to like an industrial version of bands like Malevolent Creation. So like early Fear Factory, namely Soul of a New Machine, and Strapping Young Lad. Granted, those bands aren't from Florida, but there is that early death metal sound in here too, and I love the riffs on here. These guys stuck to straight up death metal riffs and just sort of employed an industrial atmosphere and sense to the music, and I really, really enjoyed that. And that's kind of an odd thing in here. You have like sort of almost danceable grooves, but pummeling death metal riffs. And I know that sounds weird, but I mean, that's kind of an industrial metal thing where it's heavy, but it's kind of danceable. Now, this band also featured ex-members of Omnium Gatherum, which is more on the melodic death metal side from Finland. And this band, I believe, is currently on hold. I don't know if there are any plans of getting back to what they were doing. They have other releases. I just don't have them. This is the only one I have. But this one latched on me just because I wasn't looking for industrial metal when I bought this. I was looking for death metal, and I got both. So yeah, it's a really interesting release. Definitely check this out though. I mean, it pretty much will check off a lot of marks for just straight up death metal, but those industrial elements really add a lot. Check it out. The Clay People, self-titled. This was their third album, came out on Slip Disc Records, which was a subsidiary of Mercury Records at the time, and there will be other releases on this little imprint. This was an Albany, New York-based industrial metal / rock band. Now, they didn't start off that way. They started off as more of like a straight up industrial electronic act, and then the frontman started employing like more actual band members and wanted to keep the industrial elements, but sort of just kept it as like samples in there and made a metal band / rock band around it. Now, I first heard these guys courtesy of the Strangeland soundtrack. They had the song Awake on there, and that weird synth pulse that opens it really just kind of grabbed me. And then listening to the full album, this is a really interesting listen. This is one of those bands where if you removed the samples and the weird keys in there, you would still have just a straight up rock / metal band. Kind of close to nu metal, but I mean, honestly, the production does not scream that at all. In fact, it screams more straight up like kind of groove metal. The drums are all real on here. I mean, there's some sampled drum loops that are sort of peppered in there, but it's more like a layering thing on top of the real drums. And the real drums are solid. I like the drum work in here. They're kind of punky and jazzy. There's lots of really cool fills on there. And the guitar tone is really nice and chunky and heavy. Like, it's got a great ring to it. Vocals kind of range from like a metal bark to almost like goth rock crooning, which like the back half of this has a lot of like almost goth rock tropes. Like Dying to Be You on here is a particularly kind of goth rocky song. But when they're full tilt on the metal side, especially Calling Spaceship Damien Grief, I have no idea what that song's about. I know there's some sort of weird narrative to it, but the riffs on that song are absolutely killer, and there's lots of really interesting dissonant riffs on here. Now, these guys, again, would have, much like a lot of these bands, a rocky history. After this, they broke up. The label Slip Disc folded in 1999, and they were kind of just left floating in the breeze. I believe they would break up and reform several times. I don't know who all is left in the band outside the singer. I think he is the lone original member, but they still seem to reform and get together. I know there were follow-up albums to this. I just don't own them, and they were on much smaller labels, so they were a little bit harder to find. But I still really enjoy this album. Mostly the front half, I don't know, it just has like an interesting sound. It's kind of a unique one in industrial metal, and that's kind of why I picked it. Well, that, and obviously because I enjoy it. But I would strongly recommend checking this one out. I don't know much about the other releases, but I know this one is pretty damn solid. So check it out. Skrew Dusted. This was the second album from this Texas-based industrial metal band. Came out in 1994 on Metal Blade Records, and this was the follow-up to a reasonably successful debut album, Burning in Water, Drowning in Flame, which was actually produced by Al Jorgensen. Now, the main guy behind this band, Adam Grossman, started off in a crossover thrash band called Anchor Wat. I don't own any of their stuff. I feel like I probably should because I own all the Skrew stuff. Well, most of it. This is very thrashy industrial metal. The riffs scream thrash and like 90s groove metal, but when you mix in the drums and the samples, I mean, it has a fierce Ministry vibe. I mean, they worked with him. I think he was a clear influence. And honestly, this is the one I think that kind of goes unsung. The first one, a lot of people seem to know. This one, it just wasn't as successful, though it still was successful. This was probably the first time I ever heard this band, courtesy of one of the many Metal Blade samplers that were floating around the 90s. It might have been Metal Meister or Death Meister or any one of those. I heard the song Picasso Trigger and I was like, dude, that sounds so much like Ministry, and I already love Ministry. I'm probably going to check this band out. And I absolutely love this album. Pummeling grooves, that fierce industrial, like old school drum sound. The samples are sort of minimal, but it is mainly driven by the riffs, and I love the riffs on here. They are kind of meat and potatoes, but great chugs, great syncopation. It doesn't always scream like that kind of like danceable sound. It kind of gets like nice and up-tempo, a lot of like industrial D beats on here. Really fun album. Now, unfortunately, this band would kind of shift their sound later. The follow-up ones were more close to nu metal, and then they kind of ended up breaking up, I believe, after their fourth album. But they have resurfaced and have put out a new album, but there is no physical media for me to actually get. It's only downloadable, and I hate downloading albums, so I'm kind of at war with myself in that one, whether or not I should get it. But I love those first two albums from these guys. They are both killer, and I think this is the one that's probably a little bit of the unsung hero of the two. Definitely check this out. Check out, I would say, all their albums. Check them out. Why not? The first one especially, too. But yeah, Skrew's awesome, and definitely check them out. N17, or November 17, Defy Everything. This was their third album, came out in 1999 on Slip Disc Records. This was the other one I was talking about. This was an Arizona-based industrial act, and these guys were interesting in the sense that they had that very old school industrial metal sound. Like there's definitely bits of like, of course, Ministry, but also Godflesh. But they had a more modern production. It didn't sound like early 90s production. It just kind of had that feel in terms of the style. The production was more modern and a little bit more polished, though it didn't remove any of the grit. This is still very aggressive industrial metal. The guitars were particularly heavy and out front, and one of the guitarists is actually a guitarist in Eastside right now, so I mean, heavy guitars pretty much still continue on in some sense. This would be their last release, unfortunately, because again, the label folded and then they sort of all went their separate ways, which sucks because I really enjoyed this, and this was where I found out about them. This is the only one that I own by them, but this is where I heard about them courtesy of like a slip disc sampler. I can't remember what it was titled, but I know predominantly that label just signed industrial metal acts, and I thought that was really cool. There are notes of hardcore on here. You get some like really good groovy breaks. The vocals can get a little static. It's kind of like one big robotic howl and then maybe like some spoken word kind of stuff, or like those, you know, robotic chants you hear in, well, Skinny Puppy albums and such. But I really enjoyed this. It's heavier than hell. It's kind of close to Bile, though I don't think they're quite that heavy, which is another band I thought about bringing up on here, and I still may. I have enough for another one. But I really enjoyed this one. I think it kind of flies on the radar just because this whole genre kind of flies on the radar, honestly. But this was sort of a later one that came out that was maybe a little too dated in terms of its sound. People were kind of moving into, well, whatever other genres were popping up at the moment. I mean, it seems like metal genres pop up every 15 minutes out here. But yeah, solid release. Definitely check them out. This one is nice and heavy, and I dig it still. So check it out. Krupps 3, Odyssey of the Mind. This is actually their 6th album, despite the 3 on there. It was kind of an album in a series thing. Came out in 1996 on Cleopatra Records, and this was sort of a turning point for the band, or at least, you know, part of the turning point for the band. Initially, Krupps started off as a more just straight up industrial electronic act. And in the 90s, they sort of had this interesting shift. The frontman Jürgen Engler started working for a metal label in terms of like promotion and releases and such, and he really started getting into all the 90s metal, you know, namely thrash metal, death metal, and a lot of groove metal. And he sort of retooled his band's sound. And during this time, he actually had Lee Altus from Heathen and Exodus, well, currently in Exodus, playing guitars for him. And that is one of the big things in here. The guitar playing is awesome. Now, granted, this is maybe a little bit more simplified than what you're hearing in Exodus and Heathen, but his riffs are absolutely super strong. And this is a really interesting style of industrial metal because it really harks back, like way back in terms of like, you know, the bands that influenced them, like Killing Joke. There's lots of machinery loops and sounds like that, but you still have pummeling industrial drums and, again, these riffs. There's a strong sense of melody on here, and a lot of it is due to Lee's playing on here. It's just flat out awesome. This, in terms of style, I mean, I guess you could say it's kind of close to Rammstein, except there's no giant flamethrower dicks. It's a little bit more stripped down for Krupps. I got into these guys really early on, like probably early in high school when I was still just getting into metal in general. Like I was looking for anything with heavy guitars, and I picked up a compilation of theirs, and I dug what I heard. These thick, thrashy guitars, and then those like industrial drums, which, I don't know, I became really hooked on that when I heard, you know, Downward Spiral and Psalm 69. Now this band is still around. They have broken up for a period. Lee Altus is no longer in there. He is back to doing Heathen and Exodus, and I'm happy about that because Lee's a badass guitarist. But Jürgen found some other guitarists, and they are back to pretty much doing their same style, and I just really dig this. This is still a really solid album. I've had this for years, and it still absolutely bangs. So yeah, definitely check this out. It's just loaded with melody and hooks, and I mean, if you like Rammstein, just think of this as like a little bit more aggressive Rammstein. It's less, again, about the flamethrower dicks and weird imagery. Check it out, it's good stuff. Crawl, Earth. This was this Green Bay, Wisconsin industrial death metal band's debut. I have no idea when this band actually formed. I was trying to find that out, but from whenever they formed to 1992, they were actually known as Nothing Sacred. And then from 92 to 95, they were known as Bleed, and then they settled on the single word Crawl. This is very raw, straight up industrial death metal. Electronic drums, dark samples, but heavy, chuggy death metal guitars, and vocals that would suit death metal, just flat out. It's very similar to like early Fear Factory and definitely Godflesh. I would flat out say this is Godflesh worship, but they did it well. This is raw, stripped down, and ugly. This is not about any sort of danceable rhythms. This is about just delivering pummeling electronic death metal. The giant industrial drums, especially in the song Womb, they sound absolutely huge. They sound like they're banging on oil drums and shit. The riffs are almost purely just death metal riffs too. There's not a lot of static on them. They're just thick and chunky. They have some cool syncopation with the electronic drums, but overall this has more of a death metal feel than an industrial metal feel. If you actually had real drums on here, it would be fully death metal, in fact. Now they would take a interesting shift to more industrial hardcore after this, and they haven't put out anything since 1996, even though they are listed as active. And granted, that has been quite some time. I kind of hope these guys get back together because this album in particular I thought was absolutely badass. I like the hardcore oriented material, but this was just dirty sounding. I absolutely loved it. It is probably one of the heaviest ones on this entire list here. And I mean, if you love Godflesh and Fear Factory, definitely check this out because this is absolutely banging. And finally we have Frontline Assembly, Millennium. This was their 7th album, released in 1994, and this was their debut on Roadrunner Records. This is honestly one of the most different albums in their entire discography because this is essentially their industrial metal album. This band had been around since 1986. Bill Lieb is very well known in industrial communities. They were based out of Vancouver, and this guy's been doing industrial music in general for years. Their earlier material really didn't involve any guitars whatsoever. It was more machinery noises, danceable club rhythms, but it was again very dark and foreboding. At this point, he had hooked up with his still partner in crime when it comes down to songwriting, Rice Fulber, and they decided they wanted to do a more metal-centric album. So they brought in guitars. Now, the guitars in here are interesting because a good chunk of them are sampled, and they sampled some pretty notable acts. They sampled Pantera and Sepultura, namely A New Level and Walk from Pantera and Dead Embryonic Cells from Sepultura. And you can clearly hear those riffs. They chose very distinct moments in those songs, and obviously done with permission. But they also had played guitars in there where they got some guitarists, and one of those guitarists happened to be a still relatively unknown Devin Townsend. He actually contributed guitars on, I believe, 3 tracks on here, and this was before he actually got Strappy Young Lad together. Now, this is just really interesting because it sounds pretty much like everything you would hear from Frontline Assembly, just with guitars. They like their danceful rhythms, the dark atmosphere, movie samples, which you have stuff from Falling Down and Full Metal Jacket, and it builds this caustic atmosphere. But then you slap some metal riffs on top, and all of a sudden you can pretty much mosh to this or dance to this. You can start a mosh pit on a club dance floor, even if it's not a metal show night. You can. I don't know if you should. Probably get kicked out. But yeah, this is one of those albums, much like a lot of KMFDM albums, where it's still heavy. It still has tons of like kind of thrashy riffs, but it might make you shake your ass a little bit because there's a lot of fun boogie to this. Now, this I think is definitely one of the more well-known ones on here. I mean, outside of metal circles, Frontline Assembly is very well known. But this one might be the only one that metalheads know, namely because it was their first one on Roadrunner. I mean, Roadrunner actually went out and re-released all their older albums too, I believe. And the fact that you had these very notable riffs on there from very established bands at that point. This one, again, might be a little bit more well-known, but still, it's a standout in their discography just because it's notably different. They would employ guitars a little bit more in further releases, but not as much as they were present on here. So this one is probably the standout as the real metal release. So if you have never heard this, check it out. I actually recommend like most of Frontline Assembly's work. I'm a big fan of them just in terms of the straight up industrial material they do. But this one is pretty much for the metalheads. So yeah, check this one out for sure. All right, that knocks out another underrated albums, and again, I don't know where I'm going to go from here. A lot of different subgenres to check. There's a lot of different ones to go back to, but I really enjoyed this one. I might do a second part to this because this one really kind of took me back. And it wasn't like the metalcore one where, yeah, it took me back, but I'm still really not into it. This one took me back, and I actually still have a lot of fond memories. So this one's aged maybe just a little bit better for me just because I had such a strong connection to this, because this was definitely more in my formative years of being a metalhead where I discovered this whole interesting subset. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new to the channel, subscribe because we do stuff like this all the time. We will catch you later.